Part 1: The Ledger of the Butcher Species. The discovery began not in the grand observatories of the core worlds, but in the freezing, lightless basement of the 7th Sector Cartographic Vault. For 300 standard cycles, the vault had existed as a graveyard for dead data, a cavernous, automated archive carved into the hollow core of a barren moon, storing trillions of petabytes of corrupt navigation logs, shattered navigational buoys, and derelict beacons recovered from the lawless fringes of the Perseus Veil. It was routine, dead-end archival maintenance. An automated subroutine, running a standard algorithmic cycle through a battered, lead-shielded flight recorder salvaged from a 600-year-old drifter hull, flagged a series of anomalous quantum harmonics. The encryption was archaic, brutalist, and dense. It relied not on photon lattices, but on crude magnetic polarization and heavy electromagnetic shielding. When the Directorate's decryption arrays finally cracked the final security partition, a single, uncorrupted star chart resolved on the holoprojectors, a yellow G-type dwarf star tucked away in an unremarkable spiral arm of the Orion Spur. Attached to the coordinates was a single phonetic designation that had not been spoken aloud in the Grand Assembly for centuries: Sol 3. Earth. Within 6 hours, the sector archivist had bypassed the regional governors and triggered a direct Class Alpha priority alert to the Grand High Council. By the 8th hour, the planetary archives of 40 star nations were locked down under military secrecy protocols. To the modern, civilized star nations of the Galactic Concord, humanity was not merely a forgotten civilization. They were the galaxy's premier mythological nightmare. The Concord's historical ledgers, compiled from terrified Outer Rim encounters, frontier skirmishes, and intercepted radio transmissions during the previous epoch, painted humanity as an apex biological anomaly. They were a species birthed on a hyperdense, tectonic death world characterized by violent weather extremes, suffocating oxygen levels, and crushing gravity. According to the ancient taxonomies, their biology was fueled by caustic chemical compounds and adrenaline surges that allowed them to sustain horrific physical trauma while continuing to fight. Worse than their biology was their psychology. In the Concord's philosophical treatise, civilized species achieved interstellar travel through unified, peaceful scientific collaboration. Humanity, by contrast, had mastered kinetic slaughter before they had even figured out how to leave their own atmosphere. Their recorded history was an unbroken, 4,000-year chronicle of planetary civil wars, ideological purges, and industrial meat grinders. They were a race that split the atom not to power their cities, but to construct continent-flattening fission bombs to drop on their own kin, and then kept thousands of those warheads on hair-trigger alert for centuries just in case they ran out of things to hate. For generations, the Concord's most revered military strategists had treated the Terran question as an existential sword of Damocles hanging over the rim. Ancient defense doctrines had been authored based entirely on the mathematical horror of what would happen if humanity ever achieved reliable hyperdrive technology. It was universally accepted that if the butcher species ever broke out of their stellar quarantine, they would descend upon the peaceful, civilized sectors like an unstoppable tidal wave of heavy armor, ballistic fury, and unrelenting conquest. And now, after 6 centuries of silence, the galaxy held the exact hyperspace vector to their front door. In the high towers of the Concord capital, behind sealed blast doors, the Directorate debated through the night. The coordinates were real. The quarantine had broken. The ancestral cradle of the galaxy's most terrifying conqueror race was sitting entirely exposed, just a single hyperspace jump away. Part 2: The Millennium Spectacle. The classified seal on Sector 001 held for less than 36 standard hours. When the leak inevitably breached the central data networks, it did not merely make headlines, it shattered the collective consciousness of 40 star nations. The infosphere across 3,000 populated systems suffered an unprecedented data traffic cascade. Trillions of sentient beings woke to emergency broadcasts flashing across personal visors, metropolitan skyscrapers, and orbital transit hubs. The myth was real. The butcher world had been found. Within days, the galaxy was consumed by an intoxicating mixture of paralyzing dread and manic euphoria. Centuries of peace had made the galactic concord comfortable, decadent, and thoroughly obsessed with spectacle. News conglomerates fought multi-billion credit bidding wars for exclusive subspace telemetry feeds. Xenological institutes hosted continuous, round-the-clock panel discussions, debating the nature of the humans. Would the Concorde find a hyper-militarized society bristling with orbital dreadnoughts and planet-cracking ballistic batteries? Would they be met by a savage warrior caste demanding blood tribute, or an ancient, brooding empire waiting for the right moment to wage war on the stars? Doomsday cults took to the streets in the outer colonies, declaring that the galactic cycle of judgment was at hand. Stock exchanges in the trade capitals plummeted, then soared to record highs as weapons contractors and luxury diplomatic firms realized the sheer scale of the historic encounter. The Grand Assembly at the Concorde's core was paralyzed by bitter debate. The high admirals of the defense sectors demanded an immediate, overwhelming blockade fleet. Hundreds of heavy cruisers equipped with kinetic barriers and deep space interdictors to seal Sol 3 behind an impenetrable military cordon before the humans noticed them. But they were shouted down by the diplomatic corps and the ruling merchant princes. To the Concorde's ruling elite, this was not a military crisis, it was the diplomatic triumph of the millennium. If the Concorde could tame the galaxy's most ferocious predator, integrate them under the Concorde's cultural treaties, and bring the terrifying Terrans into the fold as client shock troops, the prestige of the Grand Directorate would be cemented for 10,000 cycles. The result was the assembly of the Grand First Contact Fleet, an armada designed not to fight a war, but to overwhelm a savage race with the sheer, blinding splendor of advanced civilization. At the center of the formation was the Starlight Vanguard, an 8-kilometer-long diplomatic superdreadnought. Its hull was an architectural marvel, cast from gleaming white pearl composite alloys, lined with decorative gold leaf heat sinks, and flanked by vaulted, transparent observation galleries. It carried hundreds of high diplomats in ceremonial robes, philosopher-scholars, linguistic decoders, and cultural emissaries chosen from the most prestigious bloodlines in the galaxy. Surrounding the flagship were 58 Grand Capital vessels. 12 Aegis-class heavy escort cruisers, their multi-layered kinetic deflectors and prismatic energy shields tuned to withstand standard naval broadsides, formed an immaculate defensive perimeter. Beside them floated 6 massive floating pavilions carrying banqueting halls, luxury suites, and diplomatic gifts of rare isotopes and fine silks. Tucked into every formation were dozens of high-bandwidth media corvettes, armed with thousands of autonomous subspace broadcast drones. Every single angle of the arrival, every communication handshake, and every microsecond of the encounter would be routed through quantum relays directly to trillions of interactive holographic displays across 4 galactic arms. Schools and universities were granted planetary holidays. Industrial fabrication lines across the core sectors were powered down to minimum draw. From the glittering spires of the capital worlds to the crowded subterranean mining sectors on the rim, entire populations gathered in public amphitheaters, private residences, and planetary plazas. Trillions of eyes were fixed on the synchronized countdown clocks ticking away on their screens. The Grand First Contact Fleet aligned its warp vectors at the edge of the Perseus Veil. With a blinding flash of blue tachyon light that resonated across local sensor arrays, the 58 magnificent ships slipped into hyperspace, diving straight toward the ancestral home of the galaxy's darkest nightmare. Part 3, The Dead Cradle and the Red Iron. The space above the third orbit of Sol tore open in a cascade of brilliant blue light as 58 grand vessels translated into real space. Across thousands of worlds, trillions of HoloNet viewers watched through crystal-clear feeds as the Grand First Contact Fleet settled into an immaculate ceremonial vanguard. Long-range sensor arrays swept the inner system, and the automated camera drones drifted outward to capture the historic panoramic shot. On the broadcast, the Concorde's lead commentator spoke with practiced, soaring grandeur, her voice echoing through packed planetary plazas. Citizens of the Concorde, we have breached the threshold. Before us lies the cradle of humanity, the fabled warrior race whose very name has cast a shadow across our histories for 6 centuries. In mere moments, our diplomatic envoys will initiate protocol with the Terran High Command. We ask the galaxy to witness this triumph of peace over savagery. The commentator's voice faltered. Then it stopped entirely. The optical arrays on the Starlight Vanguard pierced through the thick orbital dust bands, rendering the surface of Earth in excruciating, ultra-high-definition resolution. Across the entire galactic concord, a suffocating silence fell over billions of living rooms, banquet halls, and planetary squares. There were no sprawling planetary fortress cities. There were no thousand-ship orbital defense armadas, no planetary kinetic batteries tracking their approach, and no legions of armored human conquerors waiting to unleash hell. Below the fleet spun a silent, blackened tomb. Entire continental plates had been reduced to vast, seamless plains of jade-green vitrified glass. The oceans were completely gone, replaced by cavernous, cracked salt basins where tectonic faults had buckled under incomprehensible thermal shock. Gigantic impact craters, hundreds of kilometers wide and glowing with the faint, sickly blue luminescence of ancient, industrial-grade antimatter saturation strikes, chewed through the planetary crust down to the mantle. The legendary Terran butchers had not simply been defeated. They had been systematically, clinically exterminated down to the molecular level. On the bridge of the Starlight Vanguard, high diplomats stared at their consoles in frozen incomprehension. Sensor officers frantically scanned the ruins for biological signatures, power grids, or automated distress beacons. There was nothing. The homeworld of the galaxy's greatest terror was an irradiated ash heap. Before the Science Division could launch an atmospheric probe, proximity klaxons shrieked across all 58 vessels simultaneously. Gliding out from behind the scarred silhouette of the dead moon, a single ship dropped into low planetary orbit. It bore none of the graceful, artistic design tenets of the Concorde, nor did it match the crude ballistic profiles expected of human warships. It was an enormous, blocky Arcanium industrial ore freighter, a brutalist slab of light-swallowing black metal that seemed to absorb the very rays of the yellow sun. Faded into its unyielding, seamless armor plating was the utilitarian red insignia of the Communist Splupian Union. It was completely impervious to the lethal background radiation of the dead world, drifting through the vacuum with absolute, unhurried mechanical indifference. Desperate to maintain order on the live broadcast, the High Captain of the Starlight Vanguard initiated an immediate, wideband diplomatic hail. Unidentified vessel, this is the Grand First Contact Fleet of the Allied Concord of Worlds. We come on an historic mission of universal peace. We request the sovereign authority of this star system. A deafening burst of low-frequency static slammed across the fleet's communication array, violently overriding the diplomatic encryption channels and blasting raw audio directly into the bridges of every conquered ship, and straight out to trillions of live holonet viewers across 40 star nations. The voice on the other end was not a fearsome warlord or a grand monarch. It was a low, grating, deeply irritated Splupian logistical officer who sounded like he had just been interrupted during a routine inventory audit. Attention unauthorized vessels, you have breached sovereign communist Splupian Union territorial airspace. The human vermin were liquidated decades ago. Xeno scum should stay out of our system. The diplomatic corps never had a chance to formulate a reply. The ore freighter did not bother to raise primary void shields, spool up spinal beam cannons, or maneuver into a combat vector. On its lateral hulls, a series of automated point defense kinetic turrets snapped into position with microsecond precision. A single, automated defensive burst of solid kinetic slugs discharged at 0.3 times the speed of light. To the audience watching across the galaxy, there was no battle. There was no exchange of fire. Relativistic slugs traveling at 90,000 kilometers per second crossed the void in fractions of a millisecond. The Concorde's prized prismatic energy shields and heavy deflector barriers offered as much resistance as wet paper. The kinetic shockwaves alone ignited localized atmospheric fusion reactions in the vacuum. In the span of an eye blink, the 8-kilometer Starlight Vanguard was cleanly bifurcated, its primary reactor collapsing into a blinding miniature star. The 12 Aegis-class heavy escort cruisers were pulverized into expanding clouds of shredded alloy.